Hi everyone. I'm going to be joined by Shahid Buttar in a little bit. He's running against Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco's 12th district. I'm so honored that he's going to be joining me. I have a lot of questions to ask, but we'll see how many we have time for. Of course, if you guys have any questions, if you've been paying attention to what's been happening in California, in the Bay Area, in San Francisco in particular, there's been a lot of activity. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. As you guys know, I'm normally based in San Francisco. I've actually been in Arizona for the past couple months and heading back to the Bay Area in the next 10 days. So I'm pretty excited to be heading back. Not quite sure what to expect. It sounds like there's a few more, businesses, organizations, establishments that are going to be reopening in the next couple weeks, it sounds like. So that's also promising, but there are a lot of things to be discussed. There's still a lot of uncertainties, as we all know. So I'm curious to hear what Mr. Buttar has to say about some of those things. So we'll give him a couple minutes to join. And thanks again for tuning in. Excited to talk about all the hot topics that are currently happening at the moment. But at least there's some good news. It's just sometimes you gotta hold on to it. Another thing that I hope that we're gonna cover at some point in the next hour is universal basic income. You might know that Andrew Yang really brought it to the forefront last year when he was running for president. And now it seems to be catching steam because of COVID-19. There's cities across the country that are running their own version of it, different pilot programs. Apparently it's happening in Stockton and also Long Beach and possibly even San Francisco. So I'm also wondering what people's thoughts are on that being more of a possibility than even a year ago. So many changes taking place, right? So stay tuned for more. And if you want to find out about Sounds from the Street, you can follow me or follow that page on Facebook. And also follow Mutiny Radio. Sounds from the Street wouldn't exist without Mutiny Radio. We started out as Pirate Cat back in the day, about 15 years ago, actually probably about 12 years ago. And then we literally had a mutiny against the guy who started Pirate Cat because he wasn't behaving. He wasn't really sticking to the rules. So the DJs kind of took over from there. And it looks like Shahid's going to be joining us. I'm so excited. One moment.
Hey there. I'm trying to get my
Hello.
camera stabilized here. Sorry.
No worries. That's the hardest part of being on live, right? Is getting the camera in just the right angle.
Tell me about it. I'm packing different numbers of books on top of a shoebox right now. Literally. I'm going to move my laptop out from underneath it all.
Such is life.
Yeah.
I guess in the days of COVID, but even before COVID, I guess people were doing live. I just never had the time to do it till COVID.
I do think it's created a lot of innovation. Certainly people have done a lot of things that they hadn't before, I think. And also I find myself missing a lot of things I used to do, certainly, that I can't anymore,
Oh. Have you been on live before?
I have. I have to be honest with you. Each time I have to relearn how to do it. Instagram isn't a native platform for me. Twitter is a little bit more so, and like Facebook, as much as I hate it. And I like the virality of Instagram, and I really like the community of it. And like I'm less a visual thinker, so that's one of the things that I struggle with. But anyway, I'm glad to be with you.
Here we are.
Yes, indeed. Do I
Thanks
need,
so much
I
for
can kneel
joining.
down. Is this better? Here, there we go. I'll just lean back.
Yes. Are you
Okay.
comfortable? That's the other thing, because I've been
You
in
know,
situations.
as comfortable as I can be. I've done hour-long standing interviews, and people ask me like, "Why do you do that?"
Oh
But
my
it
gosh.
literally keeps me on my toes. I find that I'm just a little sharper if I'm standing. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's better that way. I totally agree when it comes to work, when it comes to interviews, you name it. Well, thanks again for joining. I'm sure you have a busy schedule right now with the general election coming up. How are you doing? How's COVID treating you?
My health is strong, thankfully. It's definitely created challenges for the campaign. You know, we can't do a lot of the things that traditionally campaigns center on, like door canvassing, knocking on people's doors, or indoor events. We did a lot of very frequent indoor events before I won the primary, happy hours, different like campaign gatherings like make buttons, like project-based gatherings. And yeah, we can't do any of that right now. So that's complicated the
Mhm.
process. Our pivot from that has really emphasized phone banking as one response to give an alternative voter outreach strategy. A silver lining in the dark cloud there is that because one need not be local to make phone calls, by pivoting to a phone banking centered strategy, we actually vastly expanded our volunteer pool. So we have hundreds of volunteers around the country making phone calls for us. And then there's a particular supporter he came from Seattle. And then most recently from Pasadena, he had put together a van called the Bernie van. It's basically a street legal art car. And it's now the Shahid van. And today we were in a march from the Embarcadero to Civic Center, challenging the descent of fascism, and talk to a crowd at Civic Center, and rode there on the top of this van, chanting defund police and the Pentagon. And it's this idea of trying to leverage outdoor spaces for campaign gatherings that are socially distant, still safe for people. We've had a lot of success reaching voters just in public space,
Mhm.
places like Dolores Park or Valencia Street when it's shut down. It's kind of a challenge, frankly, to figure out where else we can find people, because people don't congregate in the middle
Yeah.
of a pandemic. Go figure. Uh,
Right.
but that's a challenge. I mean, I figure if the pandemic were not happening, I think this art car alone, we could ride that all the way to winning the election. It's just like going around town rocking parties on every block. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, that's not the moment we're in. And yeah, the phones are a really crucial part. And this public voter outreach piece that we're doing is also an integral part of the strategy.
That's amazing. And do you feel like if the pandemic wasn't happening, do you feel like people would be paying less attention? Like for instance, with George Floyd, and I just felt like a surgence of people wanting to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if it would have been the same if there wasn't a pandemic. I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's an interesting like thought experiment, because I can't imagine the counterfactual necessarily, but I think you're onto something, certainly in the sense that the pandemic, if nothing else, it pressed a lot of people. And I think a lot of people were forced out of complacency
Hmm.
because no one's comfortable at the moment. And I think the fact that everyone has been made uncomfortable has at least opened, I think, a lot of people's minds to the possibility of what oppression means. Like there's a difference between struggle and oppression. And the struggles that everyone goes through versus the struggles that you're put through by virtue of any number of things, class, race, gender, what have you. And I think that the pandemic has woken a lot of people up, because complacency is not a thing that can survive this kind of crisis. And in the wake of complacency, I think, comes any number of things. I think for some people that apparently has become QAnon. Don't know what to say about that. I think
Mm.
for thankfully very many people it's become community and action. And I often say that we have at least two antidotes to despair. Despair is a totally legitimate thing that I think a lot of people are feeling right now. And there's at least two antidotes to it. One is community, and the other one is action. And when you put them together, it becomes incredibly regenerative. It's not just an antidote to despair. Then I think, frankly, that is the key to the solution, is community in action. And from the mutual aid projects that have sprung up around the Bay Area and around the country in the wake of the pandemic, to you mentioned the movement for Black Lives in the wake of George Floyd's murder.
Yes.
It's one thing to see legions of Americans marching arm in arm across races to defend the most basic rights of our neighbors. But to do that in a time when doing so puts us all at risk inherently, that
Yeah.
to me was so moving, to see our movement reach a place where people were willing to invite risk. And in Portland, I mean, think about what people in Kenosha have been put through. I mean, people are taking on risks to participate. I'm so proud of the people of the United States insofar as like demonstrating our mettle at a time when it is being tested. Um, and I have a lot of hope and faith in that, seeing it demonstrated.
That's great. I think we need more of that right now, more than ever. We talked about it a lot in the recent past, but I think now it's like we really need, a candidate like you that's going to give it to us straight and not kind of sugarcoat it like what we've been getting, unfortunately. So
It's funny you should
it's
say
kind
that.
of,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I'm curious to hear I was going to reflect on a conversation I had recently, but I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. No, I think that's something I've come to terms with more since 2016, whereas before that, I was a little bit more complacent and willing to kind of just go along with status quo. But I think with Donald Trump becoming president, me and a lot of other people have realized this just doesn't work for me anymore.
I hear that.
Or maybe it wasn't really working before, but then you just come to a certain realization over a period of time.
Yes. I think that the idea that at any point it was working, I think it relies on each of us just having inhabited any number of different privileges. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the COVID has stripped us all of our privilege. And now we all are relating to the world from a standpoint of struggle and challenge and realizing, I think for the first time for many of us, what so many others of us have frankly had to endure and grapple with and overcome and be challenged by. And even just pieces of it, I mean, like, it's not as if this moment has exposed people of all races to the specter of police violence in the same way. You know what I mean? I think there's an expanding awareness of challenges, but it doesn't still mean that they are equally borne. If anything, the burdens of the pandemic have been grossly disproportionately distributed, right? But to that point that you made about saying it straight, as opposed to like, sugarcoating the reality, there's and I'll try to make this historical. So I think to your point, a lot of people have grown alarmed in the last 4 years, recognizing that an aspiring tyrant is in the White House. And the problems of our society long predate him. And all of the things that created him festered and took root under the preceding administrations, both Republicans and Democrats. One of the things I this afternoon, I was part of this march, and my comments to the march, I said to people, this might be uncomfortable, but it's easy for us to oppose Trump and Pence. The hard thing is to send somebody else to Washington who will actually fight them. And
Right.
it's not enough to decry a criminal administration that is remote and only theoretically accountable to us. There are figures who are actually accountable to this city who have frankly done everything they can to pave his path while mouthing resistance for the sake of raising money from their corporate donor base. And, I'm not here for that. I've been fighting the right wing for too long to watch the fecklessness of the corporate Democratic Party and the leadership asleep at the switch. We duck into the punch of fascism rising, and we need better than that.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask you about that a little bit later.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to jump the gun. Yeah, okay.
No, that's fine. I kind of like it though, when it's almost like we're on the same wavelength, like, oh, that's exactly what I was alluding to.
Right on.
I was going to ask you, Labor Day is in 2 days, and with record unemployment numbers, and do you feel like there's a need for, bringing back the labor movement? What are your thoughts on this coming Labor Day? What are you feeling about it generally?
A general strike is long overdue. We had one in this city many years ago. We were very proud of it. I've been a part of 2 moments that for me were like hints of it. One was the morning after Bush invaded Iraq. 20,000 of us seized the financial district non-violently. We just put our bodies on all the highway off-ramps, and we held the city for 36 hours non-violently. And it was the theory was to pull the corporate plug on the invasion. And I saw what before had merely been to me an abstract principle. We learn in law school about the popular sovereignty as the basis for democratic legitimacy, but that's like words, right? But then I saw it. Like, it was like, oh, okay, this is what that meant, that we actually can claim particularly public space to impede commerce, that is the point at which the dial gets turned up. Like, we can march all day, we can wave our signs, we can tweet, but until we en masse impede commerce, it's kind of fun and games. But once you get there, once you're in the pocketbook, because Wall Street is the engine, right?
Yes.
When you impede the engine, then power takes notice. And a general strike would do it. And, you know, in terms of getting there, I was just speaking to somebody who was very disillusioned with this political moment, asking where we go from here. And I was trying to, you know, get at this point of, I think the invitation that this moment offers us, alongside the crisis that we confront, is particularly the opportunity to meet, connect with, and take action with our neighbors. This gets back to the community and action piece. Building community-based alternatives to market-based services, that's what enables a general strike. The other, an ongoing one, a sustained one that can actually assert influence, that can pull the plug on anything from the border deportation camps to the DHS goon squads to the, you know, machinations of a criminal tyrant to delay or avoid an election. You know, we have power once we assert collective action. And I think, to your point, like, the labor movement has certainly taken a beating over the last many generations. One thing I'm particularly proud of in our campaign is having, frankly, politically forced Nancy Pelosi to pass the Protecting Right to Organize Act through the House. It's the most visionary reform to labor law in a generation. She opposed it until it became too inconvenient for her in the face of criticism from both us and labor leaders. And I think she basically did it to keep labor leaders from endorsing us, which she was successful in doing. And if that's the price of their endorsements, like, I'm frankly happy for it. You know, if I can be an agent to help compel policy, I'm doing my job. And I do think that we have to reclaim our power as a people. And we can do that. We've become, I think, reduced to consumers and to supplicants, but we're not supplicants, we're citizens, and we should act like it. And I think at the very least that includes demanding the same rights that people in other industrialized countries have, like a right to health care. You know, the idea that we're a land of the free and a home of the brave, it's a joke to me. Like, we are randomly assassinated by our paid government servants. We're incarcerated at higher rates than anyone in the world. We're the agents of mass surveillance domestically and abroad, and we want to brag with the CIA running around toppling democracies at the drop of a hat, and we want to brag about being free. I mean, it's just preposterous to me.
And we can't even breathe. Like, we can't even have clean air, like the basics.
Yep. There you go. Speak it. Totally.
So, say for instance, you did have the chance to debate Nancy Pelosi. I know that's something that you've been calling for quite a while. So say that you did, what would be the topics that you would want to debate her on?
The very first thing I'd ask her is, how can you seriously not bring to the floor Representative Pramila Jayapal's bill to make healthcare a human right? It's the middle of a pandemic. The idea that cost is still a barrier to care it's indefensible. It was, I like to say, it was brutal before, it was vicious before, and now it's just stupid to the point of senselessness. And you couldn't design a system more poised to kill people if you tried. Like, that's what we have. We have a healthcare system that seems engineered to drive people into their graves. And I would love to ask the incumbent, how do you defend supporting that? When there are proposals that would fix this and make sure that, at least whatever other problems we might have, cost is not a barrier to people getting the medicine that they need and the care that they need. Not only that they need, but this is the key in the middle of a pandemic, that we all need them to get. Because when cost is a barrier to care for some and the contagion is virulent in a pandemic, if somebody can't get care, we're putting everybody else at risk for no good reason. You know, we could treat medicines in hospitals like the fire department, but instead we treat them like the yacht club. And, you know, Nancy Pelosi's part of the yacht club. I'm not. Too many people aren't. We shouldn't be treating medicine like a yacht. You know, it should be like the fire department. If you need it, you get it. It shouldn't be an object of exchange. It should be an object of need. And that's just sanity. That's not radical. Every other country's done that. And it amazes me that Americans haven't had the chance to get there. And I think one reason they haven't had a chance to get there is literally that Nancy Pelosi has not shown up for a debate against a challenger in 30 years. And
Wow.
I don't know how one gets away with that.
Yeah, it's kind of, that's almost my entire lifetime, actually. So for
And she
people in
claims to
my
lead the
age
left.
group, yeah, and I'm just
Yes.
thinking people my age and younger might think there is no alternative. Do you know what I mean?
They've never heard it.
I mean, it's never existed, so how could it, But no, it's an interesting point. My next question was, what is your stance on universal basic income? You've probably been hearing about it a lot more in the news recently, the past couple years, even the past year and a half with the Democratic primary. And now there's cities in California that are now enacting it, Long Beach, Stockton, just to name a couple. What are your thoughts on that?
So a big shout out to Andrew Yang for normalizing the conversation. And this would be among the questions I'd ask Nancy Pelosi is why did you approve one-time cash payments of $1,200 for some tax filers when we could have a $2,000 a month universal basic income program? Not just, there's one argument for it from an industrial policy perspective and a workforce development perspective. All that makes sense. Even if just as an emergency response to the pandemic, we would have flattened the curve if we made it viable for everybody to stay home. How do you do that? A UBI program. Like, it's a public health initiative at the moment, but
Right.
That makes too much sense for Congress. I think the thing for me that, just to put this on the table, because I think it's important to grip, and a lot of people new to the concept don't understand this nuance. So UBI its proponents include everyone from Dr. Martin Luther King to the father of the Chicago School of Economics, which is responsible for the CIA's murderous reign of terror across Latin America, for instance. And Milton Friedman proposed it, in his view, as a way for basically to dismantle the social safety net. He talks about people needing the freedom to fail. And in Friedman's vision, a UBI program is a way basically for society to morally wash its hands of people less fortunate, cash payments, no services, do what you need, and we're done with you. And that's a very brutal vision of a UBI that I do not support. Dr. King's vision of a UBI was stacked. So a right to health care, a right to housing, a right to food, a right to education, and basic income. The critical part there is that it not become a substitute for basic needs. Basic needs, we have the wealth to provide it for everyone. There's no good reason that we don't. The only reason we don't, frankly, is the greed of accumulated capital. But when we get over that hurdle and we distribute resources, there's an opportunity for us then in the UBI program to sustain people, particularly to make their own choices. You could still, if you want the yacht club, you could do something, a bunch of money, but not everybody needs or wants to be in the yacht club. Some people might want to do other things, and a UBI program would so unleash creativity. The things that we could do as a people, I think, are staggering if we just relieved people of the burden of having to, eat only what they kill.
100%. And apparently there's people in San Francisco that are trying to get it, in the city. So that's exciting. So fingers crossed for that.
May I just make a quick riff there? You mentioned before Long Beach and Stockton. There's efforts here and elsewhere in promoting UBI. Just a quick shout out to local activism and legislation. So many things can happen at the local level. Here in San Francisco, among the things that we've pioneered are a right to civil representation for people facing eviction. This is another question I'd ask Pelosi is how can you not justify embracing HR 6515 to cancel rents and mortgages and keep people in their homes? But that right to civil representation or universal composting, that's another thing that we pioneered here in San Francisco. The UBI program that people are proposing in other places, local government can just provide a huge opportunity to establish a beachhead for policies, experiments that can find their way up into other legislatures. So I'm just noting there the huge opportunity it presents. And the other thing is city council members tend to be very responsive to their constituents, much more so than, for instance, members of Congress, right? Nancy Pelosi shows up like once every 6 months in San Francisco if we're lucky. And, the most recent time was just so she could flaunt the local rules and have her experience, I suppose. You know, the accessibility of local officials is much greater, and their relative influence over the body is greater. Congress has 435 people in just one of the chambers. The largest city councils in the country have 40, 50 people on them. Most don't have more than a dozen. It's a much more viable track to advance innovative ideas. And so I'm saying that as a candidate for Congress, just encouraging people to look close to home as well, because a lot happens there.
Absolutely. We got to support our local Congress people.
And supervisors and state assembly members and state senators, right.
Definitely. And what inspired you to get into politics?
So it depends on what you mean by politics. I can tell you the story of what prompted my run. But like in a bigger sense, what drove me to politics was the alarm around the Bush administration 20 years ago. I was in law school when the Bush versus Gore decision was decided. And so I'm studying what passes for law in this country as I watch it basically fall to pieces in front of me. And frankly, the Supreme Court hasn't been legitimately composed since. It's a forgotten analysis, but at the time, the Supreme Court basically contrived its future succession. And that's a circularity in the law. Everything that happened in the last 20 years as a result of that, frankly, I don't take much more than with a grain of salt jurisprudentially. And think about the Supreme Court now with the likes of Brett Kavanaugh on it, a Bush-era torture lawyer, literally an international criminal who can't travel anywhere else for fear of being legitimately detained and prosecuted for international crimes, has a lifetime seat on our Supreme Court. And just to randomly chase a rabbit there, I have a proposal to end judicial life tenure and create 18-year staggered terms for justices of the Supreme Court. And that's a way that would recover the court as a neutral institution without subverting its independence. But in terms of what got me into politics, it was this alarm around the rule of law falling to pieces. My family came to the country as I'm an immigrant. I was 2 years old when we came here. And so the construction of the United States and America as this place of liberty and opportunity alongside inequality and genocide and slavery and wars for profit, that duality has always been very present in my mind. And when I was in law school, it was for me a very empowering experience and also a very alarming experience, because as I was learning more, I came to see greater depths of the long-standing crisis. Everything from, this is an interesting arc. About maybe 20 minutes ago, you said something about me saying it how it is.
Yeah.
So among the things I learned about was a mode of reasoning that I recently had a chance to speak with a supporter about, and just begat this conversation. Legal realism is a somewhat out of favor mode of interpreting the law based on the outcomes on the ground. So a legal realist might say, you have a First Amendment right, theoretically, to speech or assembly or to petition the government for redress of grievances, but tell that to the DHS person in Portland who's putting tear gas canisters into the skulls of people exercising that right. How much of a right do you really have in the face of that reality? The rights aren't the words on the paper, right? That's a legal formalism. That's the pretension of people who bury their heads in the sand and read books but refuse to go outside. The law is what happens. That's the law. I don't care what the words on the paper are. And so legal realism is also, I think this moment with COVID, I think, is forcing people to a realism, to understand like, oh, right, we sing that anthem about a land of the free and the home of the brave. And what's the name of the latest person who got gunned down for no good reason in which city again? And it's like, that is a troubling set of, conflicting principles to grapple with. And I think that realism that so many people are waking up and be like, oh no, it's like that. And we've been dealing with this for how long? Oh, and I think for people to reinterpret the past, recognizing that the images we see are just the ones that we can now get because we suddenly have, cameras in our pockets. But how bad was it 40 years ago? How bad has it been? How long has it been this bad? Why do we have police again in the first place? I think people are pulling on threads and finding the entire sweater unraveling. And there is something at the same time that that's very disturbing, I think
Yes.
there's also a real opportunity for us to build the new in the shell of the old. And I'm excited about that.
Yeah, it's an opportunity, right? There's a lot of opportunities right now, and hopefully people are seizing those if they can, if they're able to. Because I know there's a lot of people struggling right now too, just in their own personal world, and maybe they're not able to pay attention to what's going on in the outside world.
Totally. Totally. I mean,
It's
hundreds of thousands of
complicated.
people are just gasping for breath right now. Millions of people are just literally gasping for breath. I hear you. I feel very privileged to even, frankly, be on my feet at a time like this.
Yes, me too. So this question's kind of a tangent, but I read on your website that you crossed paths with Diamond Dave
Yes.
uh, from Mutiny Radio, and I
Yeah.
actually started at, well, it used to be called Pirate Cat Radio back in the
Yes.
day, and
Right.
I was wondering, have you been there before? Like,
Hell
have
yeah.
you been to the?
Of course. Yeah. No,
I
I
was like, I
actually did
feel
a
like I
debate.
know him.
Maybe
Oh,
that's
you
where we
did?
crossed paths. Yeah. In 2018,
Hmm.
Diamond Dave and Global Val,
Okay.
they hosted a debate among me and some of the other primary challengers to Pelosi, two other
Wow.
progressives, and I beat each of them in the primary that year, and sort of came back this year, and I'm back again. Um, I love that space, and if you were back before it was Mutiny Radio in the Pirate Cat days, like that makes you an OG to me. So yeah, no, I was 8 comes to mind. I think was the first time I went
Yes.
there.
Yeah.
Um,
I started about
I
two
have a great
years
story
after that.
involving Dave
Oh, you do? He was great.
in 2010. Okay. Well, I want to hear yours first. You first. I want to hear your
Oh,
story about Dave, and then I'll tell
so
you.
I started because I was like, well, I don't want to work an office job. I don't want to work just an office job. I want to do something interesting now that I'm not in school and, meet people. Keep in mind, this is kind of when Facebook was just taking off. So it was kind of the old school days, like you would still meet with people in real life. So
Right.
I
Before
saw
everything
something,
changed.
everything changed, right?
Yeah.
So needless to say, I saw something on Craigslist and I was like, that sounds kind of cool. It's a cafe slash performance space slash radio station, and my degree is in broadcasting. So I was like,
Okay.
I gotta check this place out. And then lo and behold, Anthony Bourdain had been there, like the year
I didn't know that.
before.
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I could send you that clip. It was on when he did, I think it was No Reservations.
Okay.
So that was a while ago. But anyways, it was such a great collective to be a part of because I didn't really have that before Mutiny. So joining the collective was kind of like I just took off after that. Like all the stuff I never felt confident about or felt like I could ever do, I was doing it. I was going out every weekend. I was making connections with people. I was,
Nice.
interviewing, all these interesting bands at the time because I started out as a music program, believe it or not.
Nice. Okay. Right on. Right on. No, that's dope. That makes
So,
sense.
so yeah. So I was like, oh, I wonder if he'd actually been to the station. I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah, and since the race started in 20, there was a phase where I think I was going in like every 3 months to pop in
Oh,
and see
nice.
Val and Dave, and they'd interview me, and I'd give them a poem, and so I met Dave in 2003, the year I graduated from law school. This
Hmm.
same, actually, we referenced a moment here maybe 20 minutes ago when we shut down the city the morning after Bush invaded Iraq. So a few months after that, I graduated from law school, and then I was up living here in San Francisco studying for the bar exam, and I happened to live across the street from a space that I don't think is there anymore, the Brainwash at 7th and Folsom.
Yeah.
And you talked about,
Hmm.
spaces with multiple functions. This was a laundromat, bar, cafe, performance space, a little bit of an arcade. And so I used to do laundry there. And on, I think it was Monday nights, Diamond Dave had an open mic. A bunch of the other guys who I met at Diamond Dave's open mic, and I started the poetry convergence that's happened every Thursday for the last 17 years at the corner of 16th and Mission. And it hasn't survived the pandemic as well as one might hope, but for over a decade and a half, on a
Hmm.
weekly basis, people would just converge from the city and share spoken word, poetry, music, comedy. Some people would bring like acoustic instruments,
Hmm.
and frankly, it's one of the community organizing projects I've had a hand in which I am most proud. And it was Diamond Dave who brought us all together. Like, it literally would not have happened without him. And we started the corner, that Convergence, just as a training ground to try to teach each other and other poets how to hold public space, so that we could then claim public space for basically politicized lyrical ambushes. It was sort of an extension of the anti-war movement. We were it was something of a proto-Occupy strategy, where it was like occupy a space ephemerally. And then that became sort of the basis for the DC guerrilla poetry insurgency, which I started that fall when I went to Washington. It's still active as well, as is the group here, and also the Stampu. So I just saw that my battery's down to 20%, but I think it'll hold for a while.
Oh no!
We'll cross our fingers.
Do you need a charger?
I mean, yeah, exactly. I don't even know how I'd make that work, but no, I think it's good.
I've had that happen before too. So let's get to the nitty gritty then.
Yeah.
So if you were, elected to Congress, and you had the opportunity to pass legislation for universal health care, the Green New Deal, and the emergency money for the People Act, would those be kind of your top things, or what would be like your top priorities to get through?
The very first one for me is the HR 6515. That's the Rents and Mortgage Cancellation Act. So that would just keep millions of people in their homes. I think of that as like the most dire thing, that and Medicare for all. The Green New Deal, I absolutely want to fight for. I'm just as committed to it. I think those other two are more easily movable in the near term, while we seek the consensus for the very broad industrial transformation that the Green New Deal represents. Another thing that I'm very committed to is defunding police and the Pentagon. I think defunding the Pentagon is the key to unlocking the fiscal space to do all the other things. And
Gotcha.
This for me is like a really existential issue, in that I would not exist as a human being in this country at this moment in time if it were not for the excesses of our military industrial complex in other countries going back decades. My family fled a country that was subjected to serial military coups, toppling democratically elected governments, and in their wake denying basic civil liberties. And that's why my family fled Pakistan. So I am not directly a refugee, but in an indirect sense, my intergenerational path leads through the corruption and the opposition to human rights of the thing that Eisenhower created and warned us not to let off the leash. And I've seen it off the leash. I have a chapter in a book, Project Censored releases an annual volume. In its 2017 edition, I have a chapter about Ike's dystopian dream. And I talk about how he basically pointed like Babe Ruth at the right field fence, and he said, that's where the ball is going to go. And, Eisenhower said we had to stay knowledgeable and alert to avoid the military, industrial, congressional complex from destroying our rights and liberties. I don't think he could have forecast paramilitary police, CIA torture, drone strikes, a resource extraction complex sucking the literally blood of the earth from around the world coercively, even when communities and countries try to keep it from us. Add to that the literally rewards for human rights abuses, which we have given out in Washington. The head of the CIA right now is an unrepentant torturer. And the Secretary of State was the head of the CIA when that was all going on. I mean, it's just so many layers of sordid. And so to me, addressing the crimes of our national security establishment and shrinking the Pentagon to defend human rights, I think that's sort of like order of business number one. This relates to climate justice, because at the same time that we're building the consensus for the Green New Deal, we have to acknowledge that the largest institutional source of carbon pollution on the planet is the Pentagon. So if we're serious about climate justice, one thing we could do to move it forward is just to spew less carbon into the air by having a rational instead of a belligerent military footprint. Last point I'll just make here. We have real national security threats. I'll name three of them. They include a climate catastrophe that's expanding around the world, a pandemic, and an aspiring tyrant that wants to subvert the republic by keeping an election from happening. Each of those three things, the pandemic, climate catastrophe, and Trump, you can't fight any of them with a fighter jet or a nuclear missile or an aircraft carrier or some expensive weapons system. Like, none of that national security spending is actually related to any of our actual national security needs. So why exactly did Democrats, led by Nancy Pelosi, just give Trump $750 billion? Like literally unprecedented sum in our species history to spend on unaccountably on weapons. I just don't even understand how that goes down and people aren't, you know what I mean? Like it's absurd to me. And so that's high on my list, addressing the Pentagon spending and the crimes that happen behind the veil of executive secrecy. And I could chase a rabbit here about Pelosi's particular role in advancing executive secrecy, but that's maybe for another day.
Yes, maybe our next interview,
I look forward
if
to
you
it.
want to come back. My next question was, I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to this or noticed it. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we noticed that local newspapers, well, as you probably already know, a lot of local newspapers across the country have gone under because of the pandemic. They weren't doing well before the pandemic, and now a lot of local newspapers online, you know, we still get a lot of our local news through the newspaper online. They charge you once you look at a certain number of stories on their website. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, because I see that as kind of alarming.
It goes in both directions
Just
here.
personally.
Yeah, no, I hear this. So many, wow, you're actually biting off a lot here. And so I'm gonna miss some bases as I try to make my way around the field. And I'll,
Okay.
I will lament the ones that I skip. So on the one hand, I totally hear you that like the access to the information in journalism is really critical to have an informed discourse and electorate and decisions. One of the challenges in the media landscape is that media is not just a public good; it's also a business. This is an unfortunate way in which capitalism subverts democracy by making access to a vital public good, information and analysis, contingent on the market. And one of the unfortunate dynamics, particularly with the rise of online media, Craigslist comes to mind, is the decline in available sources for established revenue sources for newspapers, particularly classified advertising. So like the emergence of online advertising really drove a hole in the mid 2000s and the 90s in the budgets of news organizations that had relied on classified ads. That was sort of phase one of a dynamic that has continued. Just now when you were talking about small newspapers during the pandemic, one of the dynamics that's happening across the country, venture capital firms are buying up small newspapers only to basically sell off their assets and shut them down because it can be more profitable to do that than to run them. And, that's one thing from a business perspective. It's even worse from a public perspective because there is this vital public good that gets eviscerated. One way I've particularly related to this declining capacity in newsrooms is just the fact that there doesn't seem to be a lot of investigative capacity among journalists anymore. I've been the target of some false accusations over the last month, and one reason they were repeated is because journalists don't check their facts anymore. And they literally just printed quotes from people who had agreed to tell lies about me, and that counted as journalism. And it's like, okay, well, sure, but does anybody actually want to look at the evidence? And vindication doesn't sell as well as accusation. So when the evidence came forward, the news organizations were suddenly not so interested in the story anymore. And that is a function of the declining capacity of journalism. And so at the same time that and maybe a practical tip for your friend, just open the news story in an incognito browser, and you generally 9 times out of 10 you can still access the content. So use that workaround. Totally use the workaround. If you're using most browsers on your laptop, it's like Control-Shift-N. If you're using a mobile device, usually you can open a private browser, and if you open the link there, you can work around some of those limitations that the platforms try to impose. But I'm just pointing out that the legitimate need for news organizations to fund journalism and the vital public interest in funding journalism. I think, frankly, that people getting subscriptions to news organizations is not a lot to ask for, and it's not the answer, really, because we frankly should have a more robust ecosystem that doesn't rely on the vagaries of the market to provide a public good. So, long arc. I think I hit most of the bases I wanted to there.
Yes, I'm satisfied with the answer.
Thank you.
Shifting to the energy crisis.
Yeah.
Um, how do you think Gavin Newsom has been handling it? And it seems to me like he's pretty much giving PG&E a, a pat on the back is what they like to say it. How do you feel about that? And it's the burden's kind of falling on us as the consumer.
PG&E shouldn't be getting anything from a bailout to liability protections. PG&E should be nationalized, or at least like municipalized. The fact that the company whose at least negligence and possibly malfeasance has driven dozens of Californians to their graves and literally incinerated entire communities is still available to make a profit. It should not be a profit-making enterprise. And the fact that it is still a profit-making enterprise, despite the fact that it has laid such a trail of devastation, suggests to me that our public policy is simply weak. Now, I like to extend this. I think there are entire industries where we should take the profit motive off the table. We don't, for instance, already allow a market in vote trading. You can't sell your vote. That's like a law, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's any number of things that we could say you shouldn't be able to sell. The idea that you can pull something out of the ground that didn't belong to any of us in the first place and sell it, in my mind, and maybe I'm too or like more influenced by indigenous thinking than like contemporary thinking, but it's just insane. What flight of hubris would drive anyone to think that just because you can pull it out of the ground makes it yours? I mean, this is
Right.
absolutely rapacious on its face,
Mm-hmm.
and that's literally how we built the civilization, is pulling things out of the ground that weren't ours to begin with and selling them. And then, running around bragging about how smart we are. I think that extraction is an area where the profit motive skews outcomes. I think prisons are a place, and weapons. There's absolutely no reason that any weapons manufacturer or prison should be operated for profit. It's gross. It's
Yes.
absolutely disgusting. It's revolting to me. And that's also established public policy. People make hand over fist in this. These are billion-dollar industries. $750 billion in the case of weapons, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are other places, fossil fuel extraction. Well, we lump that into extraction. So extraction, weapons, these are industries that thrive on predation, and we shouldn't incentivize that in the way that the market incentivizes activity.
Totally. And I like that you laid it out that way. And we incentivize and we subsidize,
Yep.
certain organizations, certain industries when maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we need to invest in other things like what we just talked about, healthcare, for instance. Maybe we wouldn't have COVID. Or maybe we would have been able to control it sooner. I don't know.
I think
There's
we
a lot of
certainly could have
theories.
flattened the curve a lot sooner.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't really touch on this, and it's not directly related to like Medic for All, but in terms of COVID preparation, people, and it does relate to the private prisons piece, a lot of people discount how much domestic manufacturing capacity is slave labor in prisons. We don't make a lot of things in the United States anymore. And among the few places that we make anything is in prisons. One of the reasons why we were very vulnerable to the pandemic is because we lost domestic manufacturing capacity to the outsourcing wave of the 90s. That's why there was a PPE shortage. And this gets back to, so many hospitals are profit-making enterprises that they actually drove their inventory systems based on the latest management techniques applied to for-profit inventory turnover operations. Just-in-time inventory is the name of that management practice. But there's no reason that hospitals should be using inventory management practices from for-profit enterprises. It's stupid. It's another place where we just incentivize dumb things, and people forget that the market is a condition of the legal regime. We can set the parameters for the market through policy. That's what policy does. When there's a financial crisis and Wall Street takes $2 trillion from the public till, that's a policy choice, right? When Nancy Pelosi hands out tax breaks for millionaires in the middle of a pandemic, averaging $1.6 million each to 43,000 people who claim over $1 million in income every year, that's a policy choice. And we shouldn't be treating these things as if they're inevitable. Every time I read a newspaper describe a piece of legislation in Washington as a must-pass bill, There's no such thing. Those are just bills that Nancy Pelosi said have to pass. And so the press describes them that way. And it's like, no, these aren't must-pass bills. This is flagrant, absurd, irrational, down the toilet, especially in the context of defense spending. And you make this point. We could be spending that on PPE. We could be spending that on teachers. We could be spending it on nurses. We could spend it on things that keep people alive. And instead we keep hurling all this money at things that leave people dead. And that's a policy choice. That's our choice in a democracy. We can make different choices. And I'm eager for us to do that.
I like the way you think. Let's send you to Washington.
You're very kind. Thank you. I would be so honored.
Do you have time for a few more questions?
I think so. The real question is if my phone holds up, but I think so. Yeah, let's give it a shot. If
Okay.
it goes dark suddenly, don't take it personally. I'm sorry.
I won't.
Okay.
So the next hot topic I'm sure you've been thinking about, the housing crisis that isn't just in San Francisco, it's actually California. It's been going on for a while, and now it's really happening. People are leaving the city in droves. So I wanted to know what your plan was for that.
I relate to this in maybe just to lay out my feelings about it first before I get to policy. So I've confronted housing insecurity in my own life before, in my late teens, and it's really hard, and no one should have to go through it. I have supporters who live in my neighborhood, an entire community of people who've shared an address for years, and they're all getting evicted, an entire community of people. And I see it not just through the lens of the individuals who are now going through dire crisis, but I look at it through the lens of a community that's losing an anchor of the community. Like, it's not, this is a point here I'm making. It's not just the private harm internalized by the people who went under the boot. There's a public good here also that gets lost, and that's the vibrancy of our communities as longstanding residents get pushed out. And that's been true every neighborhood that's ever gotten gentrified. That's been true in, and it's true now as people are being displaced by COVID shutdowns and other things driving this kind of challenge. Now, I want to also make clear that the housing crisis long predated the pandemic, and this is an area where I see the corporate Democratic Party playing on the wrong team. And I wonder if it would be any different if the party weren't led by a wealthy commercial landlord. Nancy Pelosi makes over $1 million a year in rental income, which that's a lot of money. You have to own a lot of things to make that much money in rent, and it might be one reason why federal spending on affordable housing has fallen through the floor in the last 2 generations. It's interesting to locate the decline in spending on affordable housing with the relentless increase in federal spending on the military. And just to be clear, the money that we've saved, and I'm using air quotes saved, by not investing in affordable housing anymore, and this decline happened in the 80s and in the 90s, continuing throughout Nancy Pelosi's tenure, that money was dwarfed by the massive, much bigger sums that we continue to increase in the military budget. So it's not like we don't have the money. We just haven't chosen to spend it on affordable housing since the 70s. And that's crazy. And that's not just the appropriations for the money. There's also a separate, it was an amendment, the Faircloth Amendment, that restricts the federal government from building new public housing. And what I'd like to see us do is invest in a new era of social housing owned by the government, but accountable to the residents and the community. And that's something we haven't really done before. In the previous era, the experiments with federal housing tended to be unaccountable to residents, and it begat any number of predictable problems. If we have community accountability and resident accountability with public ownership, that to me is the sweet spot. And, San Francisco in particular demonstrates how important it is to have public housing, because if you don't, you end up with a city of rich people. And that's not a very vibrant civic culture in which to allow people of all kinds and sorts and types and races and ages and professions and crafts to flourish. You can't have a vibrant community if it has just one socioeconomic class. And that's the inevitable outcome of a market, commodity-driven housing market. And we can do better than that. And I think we, not just for each other, but for our city.
Absolutely. 100%. I'm wondering if that's their goal. I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist when it comes to the COVID I'm not sure if you are, but
I wouldn't have located to COVID, but I do think that's the goal with respect to declining the federal spending on housing, is to make cities, you know, more and more priced out. But I'm
yeah,
curious to hear where you were going to go with it.
that COVID, another question that I had was about antitrust and how it applies to the cyber barons. Maybe you're aware that, Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook were in Washington, or they testified, and how that's affecting, our everyday lives. I mean, it's pretty much infiltrated and affected our everyday lives now, whereas it wasn't really 10 years ago. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
I had a chance to write a few years ago about several ways that antitrust enforcement could be dialed up of tech
Hmm.
companies, and I'm very eager to see that happen. Some of that can happen through existing statutes, and it almost has to happen in the regulatory agencies, the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission, but Congress can help push it. And other things can be done through new legislation, which I also want to extend. So just to separate those two. First, in terms of the existing legal regime, there's a doctrine in the law. It's quite revolutionary. It's called the Essential Facilities Doctrine, and it's been all but forgotten. It was the ground on which courts in one era broke up AT&T into smaller businesses. It was the same principle used to keep railroad companies from monopolizing bridges over the Mississippi. And it's the
Right.
very same ground that could declare that some social networks are effectively, you know, essential facilities. It could alternatively lead courts to say that social networks should have interoperable data. So if somebody wants to defect from some corporate platform that keeps degrading its privacy standards, that they can go to a different platform and take their data with them. At the moment, you can't, because it's all proprietary and locked down. So the essential facilities doctrine could be key in releasing consumers from the sort of walled crystal gardens that the tech platforms have created for us. Another thing to note here is that beyond reviving the essential facilities doctrine, the other thing that I wrote about in that piece was particularly consumer harms beyond price. So at the moment, antitrust regulators presume a harm to competition only when consumers bear increasing prices. There has to be a harm to consumer welfare, and that's sort of their linear, very myopic view about how to evaluate it. But there's other ways to harm consumers. And one way, just to make this really clear, how do you have a price harm if the service is free? Right?
Hmm.
So that,
Hmm.
and we applied this analysis, to any number of things. Facebook comes to mind as the easy example. I believe the academic's name who wrote this paper was Lena Khan, who wrote about, Facebook at one point presented itself as the more privacy protective alternative to MySpace. That's how it displaced the previous behemoth of the social media universe. And as competition diminished, what did Facebook do? Consistently degraded its privacy protections. It didn't price higher. It's not like it started charging for free things. I mean, frankly, it did for branded pages, but it wasn't a price harm. It was a privacy harm. Regulators don't look at that. So for free services, regulators have had no way historically to detect harms to consumer welfare. So I wrote this article to try to help people understand how regulators can better enforce the existing laws to rein in tech platforms. Now, just to complicate this, there also needs to be new laws established to do some things like, this isn't so much tech platform related, but it's in the antitrust bucket. One thing I want to do is end the statutory exemptions for sports leagues. At the moment, many sports leagues have their specific laws written to exempt them from the antitrust laws that other sectors are subject to. And if sports leagues are going to deny their players the most basic rights to speech, which they have, even if more recently they've been a little bit more hands off, and even if athletes are gaining some basic rights to speech, I've seen sports leagues prove themselves historically too hostile to both worker rights and speech rights to be awarded the public subsidy of an antitrust exemption. And this is just a distributive question. There's no particular art of public policy here. It's just how much money are we going to put in the pockets of these unaccountable sports owners versus, allow to be on the public market. And I think the idea that there might be competition in these leagues might be really good for players and fans. I don't know. Go figure. Let's find out. I think another place that antitrust laws can be extended, I'm very adamant about creating a basis for political antitrust. So this gets tricky and interesting. The Supreme Court recently threw its hands up in the air saying it can't police instances of partisan gerrymandering. So if a state legislature